you still want a book and you want it signed and you don't want to pay shipping, just contact Lori. She's wearing the monkey hat, you can't miss her. And we can take your money, we can sign it, and Adam can bring it to the next meeting. We just didn't think we were going to sell all the ones that we brought.
Actually, there's about 25 books that I bought for the short course.
Oh, okay.
And we can sell them here and we can get some more.
Oh, okay, so there are more books. So after this talk, if people want some more books, it sounds like there is a supply here that we can replenish ourselves and make it work. So I'm going to talk about queen rearing and honeybee breeding. And one of the nice things about this talk is that I don't think that this is limited to the perspective of natural beekeeping in any way. Breeding, you select for traits that are important to you. I select for traits that are important to me, and I think you should select for traits that are important to you with however you're managing bees. So none of this is going to be putting a roadblock in any of that. So I have two documents that I just want you to be aware of on our website. The first one up there, the queenrearing.pdf, that's actually a PDF of this presentation that I'm about to give. I break some of the PowerPoint rules, and I have a lot of text on some of these slides. And I do that so that when you download it and you look at it, you're really seeing exactly what I was talking about. And I tell you that it's online, so I don't want anybody trying to copy down what's on these slides. Just try to pay attention to what I'm talking about and know that instead of what I've done sometimes is that, oh, I'll put it up on the website later. I put it up on the website before I got here, so I don't forget. So it's actually up there. If you want to check on your smartphone, you can see that it's there now. The second document, the Queen Notes, is just kind of a work in progress, and it's just some thoughts about queens and queen rearing, some of which is reflected in this talk, some of which isn't. There are some quotes that some of them are made up just because they're kind of funny. You can decide which ones are real and which ones are fake. I hint the ones from Salvador Dali and Keith Richards I made up. And so just to give you an idea, that starts out with the different ways that you can think about a queen. You can think of the queen as the mother of the bees in the colony. She's also the daughter of the colony, assuming that you didn't buy the queen and introduce her. She's also an unstunted worker, which we'll talk about in this talk. She's the ovaries of the superorganism of the hive and also the testes, as Ramona talked about. Heather has 2 mom bees, and I have some more detailed illustrations of that if that confused you a little bit, I think we'll make it clear. She's also the sperm bank of the superorganism. She's the monarch and the sex slave, or the sex slave, and the co-father of another colony. So this goes on for about 20 pages, and some of it's kind of humorous, but it's all real and all heartfelt, and something that I'm trying to develop into something more, but I wanted to make it available to you because I don't have time to present it all here. So let's go back to our raising queens. And my hope is that everyone who has one hive coming out of winter decides to raise some queens this year, and it isn't hard. So we'll start out with why should you raise your own queens. James Powers was really the first of the modern large migratory beekeepers. There were beekeepers that were pollinating almonds before him. They were doing so because it was an early source of pollen and protein to build up bees. He's the guy that turned it into the industry and made it into the driving force behind the beekeeping industry in this country. And he's quoted with saying, and I've heard several people quote him on this, that queen rearing is too important a task to leave to someone else. I mean, this is really the kernel of your beekeeping operation and something you should do yourself. I think that it's also an important and rewarding dimension of keeping bees. I think that buying mated queens all the time, it's a little bit like the difference between having a garden where you go to the greenhouse and you buy seedlings that are just about ready to fruit and put them in the ground versus setting up a grow light in your basement and planting some seeds. It's a much, and even getting to the point where you're saving seeds from your best stock. It's really, it brings beekeeping into a full circle thing rather than a consumer occupation. It allows the beekeeper to build on genetics instead of replacing them. Remember that when we buy mated queens, we have a hive that's failing or struggling or that we think should be better, and we buy a queen to introduce into that hive, that queen's already been mated somewhere else. And anything that we like about that hive, or if that hive had superseded a couple times since the last time we requeened it, any progress that we've made towards localized genetics, we just throw completely out the window when you take that queen out and you put a mated queen in from a supplier. So I'd like to see us all be able to make progress and to move forward rather than to stay in one spot. In the rearing of queens, whether you're doing it or the bees are doing it on their own, the most important thing to raising good queens is nutrition. After nutrition is how well she's mated, how many drones she mates with, and how diverse those drones are. And only after that comes the genetics of the queen. Now, that's a simple statement, and certainly if you took the worst genetics of the worst bees that you could find, that might not be true. But in general, all the bees that we have been bred by somebody. So there's quite a bit of filtering that goes on at some point in the process by the time we ever get any bees. And if you're catching your own swarms, well, those bees came from somewhere where they were healthy enough to cast off a swarm. And that says a lot about the bees where they come from as well. You, and I mean all of you, whether or not you can even find a queen in your hive, you can raise high quality queens with minimal expense and work, and I'm going to show you exactly how to do that. The beekeeping industry needs more actual breeders, and when I say breeders, I mean people that are selecting stock and propagating stock from year to year and improving and moving towards a goal, not people that are buying breeder queens and grafting from them and then next year buying another breeder queen from somebody else or from the same person and breeding them. That's a production occupation. I'm talking about breeding. I'm talking about selecting. And we need more breeders. And there's plenty of room commercially. If you can raise good queens and the word gets out that you can raise good queens, you don't need to advertise. You will have plenty of people will want your queens if you have good queens, and there's no reason that you can't. And now that you know how to raise queens, you won't be able to help yourself because it really is fun and it really does add. It is like putting a seed in the ground and seeing a plant come up. I mean, it's just so different than buying a plant and waiting for a tomato to come off of it. So what you can expect. If you prepare properly, you will be able to raise more queens than you can use. And I can say that without reservation to all of you. If you have bees, if you have one strong or even one small healthy hive, you can raise more queens than you can use. Because if all you have is one healthy hive, there's a limited number of queens that you can use. You could use 1 or 2 queens. If you have 100 hives, then you have the resources to raise thousands of queens, which is more than you can use. And again, a reasonably well-mated queen with moderate genetics will perform well. And it probably will perform better than what you're used to from buying some of the mass-produced queens, especially the queens that come out of the package industry type model. And if you maintain stock from year to year and apply some selection pressures on your stock, you will develop your own somewhat uniform strain. And that's what we should all be after. That one mistake that people make is we're very programmed to think that diversity is what we want. Genetic diversity is what we want in the bees. But infinite diversity means no consistency. So if I say I have a diverse population of bees and I'm raising queens from them, and you say, well, are the queens good? The only answer I can give you is some of them are and some of them aren't. Well, which one do you want to buy? The good ones or the bad ones? I can only tell you that I'm giving you the good ones if I've refined the stock and kind of brought it to some kind of uniformity where I have some characteristics that I can point to and say, the queens that I'm raising tend to have these characteristics. We can't guarantee that every queen has the same characteristics, but we move towards some kind of unification of the traits in the bees that makes it identifiable as a population or as a strain. So how queens are raised by the beekeeper. Queens are raised by bees as part of a system. The system has to be in place, primed, nourished, and well provisioned. Only after there is a queen-shaped hole in the system will the system produce a queen. And I hope that makes sense to you, that the bees have to really want a queen, or need a queen, or think that they need 30 queens in order to raise queens properly. So required for rearing queens, at least 1 strong hive. That's all. That's what you need. And if you want more queens than 1 or 2, then you need more resources than that. And we'll talk about cell builders later, but you need to give some thought to how you're going to time things, the hive that's going to raise the queens that you want. And when you're going to check them and when you're not going to check them, because when you're not going to check them is just as important as when you're going to check them. You want to make up your cell builders a day or 2 before you graft if you're going to graft, but you don't have to. We'll show you why that in a minute. And the bees should feel ready for cells. When I'm raising queens and when I make up a cell builder, I've made every mistake in the book. That's why I'm up here talking to you. I've made up cell builders and sometimes within a couple of hours gone and put cells in. Sometimes it works, but sometimes you can just tell the bees aren't interested yet. And then you go back the next day with another set of cells, and you put the grafts in, and when you open up the top, and even those young larvae in the queen cups get even close to the hive, you can just feel that the bees are ready for them and ready to start feeding them. And that's a hard feeling to communicate in a lecture hall with a giant screen with some words on the screen. But once you experience it, you know it. And that's really what we're going for when you're raising queens. You want bees that are really enthusiastic to raise queens. People always ask me, well, once I graft or once I prepare these cells, how long do I have before I can get them into the hive? My answer to that is as quickly as possible. I graft on my kitchen table, and my cell builders are in my front yard, and I run. And when I'm done grafting, I run back out there and I get those cells right into the colony as quickly as I can. Remember that the best care for any kind of bee larvae is bees. We can put warm wet towels over them, we can do all kinds of things, but really the best thing is to get them back to the bees as soon as possible. And so when you're thinking about how you're going to set this up, if your yard is not near your house, well then you're going to want to do the grafting in the yard somewhere, maybe in a tent, maybe in your car, maybe you set up a little lean-to. Doesn't matter what, but you want to set things up so that it doesn't take you long from grafting to getting the queens into the cell builders. Excuse me. And I'm going to skip a little bit of this other stuff as we move along here. So now I'm going to talk about ways that you can raise queens. The simplest way is a walk-away split. How many people have heard that term, walk-away split, before? And it means exactly what it talks about. You split the hive and you walk away. The only thing that you have to know when you're doing that walk-away split is you need to make sure that each half of the split has larvae or eggs or very young larvae of the right age. And that's it. Everything else the bees will take care of. If you don't know which half the queen is in, who cares? The one that doesn't have a queen is going to raise a queen. The one that does have a queen isn't going to raise a queen. So they're very easy to do. It's something that you can do even if you only have one hive. But as we move along in these techniques and get more sophisticated, what we gain is efficiency. And the walk-away split works, but it's also very efficient. And for the most important reason is that you do this walk-away split, and the bees have in the half of the split, or the portion of the split that doesn't have a queen, they're in a position where they have to take a larvae that's like a day old, and then they have to turn it into a queen, and that queen has to emerge. Then she has to harden and spend maybe a week in the hive. Then she has to go out and do these mating flights. Then she has to come back and rest for a little bit, and then she starts laying a few eggs, and then she gets laying full bore. Well, it's not until 3 weeks after she starts laying those eggs do we get any young bees to replace the bees that are in the colony. Now, if you had some open brood and some capped brood in the hive when you made the split, you've got some momentum towards getting some younger bees in there. But a month and a half is a long time, is a big generation gap to have in a colony of bees. And it's the kind of gap that can tell the bees that something's not right with the colony and can cause them to want to swarm or take some other action that might not be so good for you, like absconding or swarming or combining with another hive, or maybe attracting a swarm to come into the hive, which might not be a terrible thing. Now, saying that it's as simple as splitting the hive and walking away, there are a number of resources in the colony, and that once you've done it once just by splitting it and walking away, you're probably not beekeepers because you're not wondering about what's going on inside this box that you can't see inside of. I mean, that's kind of part of the fascination. And so once you do it once, you start thinking, well, there are all these resources. There's comb. Comb is a resource, right? If you shape the bees into a box without comb, they have to build all this comb before they can do anything. So there's comb, there's stores, there's pollen, there's the laying queen, that's a resource. There's brood, both capped brood and open brood. Capped brood doesn't require a lot of energy from the hive for them to emerge. Open brood actually requires a lot of resources from that colony to feed them and get them to the point where they can be capped and then emerge. So that's a resource and a deficit. There's foragers and there's house bees. And when you're doing a walk-away split, if you want to do it a little bit efficiently, you have to kind of think about how you're going to allocate these resources between the two portions of the split. And I think maybe the most useful shortcut to do with a walkaway split, and what I think the most important resource is the foragers. Because the foragers can be relied upon to come back to that location where the hive was. So often if I'm going to make a walkaway split, that walkaway split, if there's a honey flow on and there's resources available for the bees, I might make a walkaway split, and I would encourage you to try making a walkaway split with one frame of brood. One frame that has some capped brood and some eggs and some open brood and all the adhering bees that are on there. And the reason that you can do that is if you leave that one frame, and you're not just alone in a box, but with other frames, hopefully with a little bit of comb in there and maybe a little bit of food, but not even necessarily the food, and you leave that one frame in a box at the location where you had a hive with 2 deeps, 20 frames of bees, you've got quite a bit of foragers that are coming back to that one frame of bees. And that means that you don't have to feed those bees, right? Because you've got this huge population of foragers that are bringing food in. And when we talk about resources and we talk about food and resources, there's 2 different things. There's capped stores, or even uncapped stores. And then there's food actively coming in. And it's kind of like the difference between your paycheck and your bank account, right? Your bank account you're kind of relying on for a rainy day. Your paycheck is what you're using to live from day to day and put some away into your bank account. So if all of a sudden your paycheck goes up by 4 times, you might feel entitled or very capable of going out to eat for a nice meal or going on vacation or doing something like that. Whereas as your savings increases, it makes you feel more secure, but it doesn't really encourage you to spend more necessarily. And the same is true with bees, that stores that are in the comb, obviously they're important, it's a resource for the bees, but it's really that food coming into the hive freshly, that fresh nectar coming in, that lets the bees know that it's a prosperous time and that they can afford to spend the resources on raising some queens. And I think that's a really important distinction. And so I like to use that resource of the foragers to provide that income for the split, rather than feeding. I'm not saying that I don't feed sometimes. When I do feed, it's with honey, from a known source, not from the dollar store. But those foragers, assuming that you're not in the middle of a rainy spell or in the middle of winter. We did a queen rearing workshop yesterday in my t-shirt in Florida, so it's a little bit different situation up here right now. And so once you start to identify these resources, and especially once you start to do these manipulations, you start to think about these resources. And again, you start thinking about how to do it more efficiently, and that's how we get further and further into grafting. The downside of the walkaway split is it takes 6 weeks before any of the bees in the split will be replaced by emerging brood, except for any brood that you left in the hive when you made the split. And that's a really long time. So if you're going to do a walkaway split, it's a good idea to have in mind that after 2 weeks or 3 weeks, you might put in another frame of capped brood and just give them a little boost, make them feel like there's more stuff going on than there actually is, because that gap in generations is really problematic. So here's a walkaway split, and you can see that they've made 2 nice little queen cells on the bottom there. So the walkaway split is easy to do, and we do it at our convenience when we want to. Another thing that you can do is you can wait until the bees start to make queen cells. How many people have ever opened up their hive and unexpectedly found queen cells in the hive? That's a good, now you've done this, now you don't have to make this walkaway split, you don't have to work to stimulate the bees to start cells, they've already done it. Because remember, the best queen cells, remember I talked about how nutrition is so important for raising queens? The best queens are born of abundance, not out of desperation, just like any human endeavor. And so if you open up the hive and you find queen cells, well, the bees have already made that for a reason without you having to do anything, and that's a good time to make a split. And many people would consider that a walkaway split by starting with these queen cells. It saves time over a walkaway split because the cells have already been started. Again, they're usually produced out of abundance. It requires no planning. It's something that you can do as you're inspecting your hives. It's a split of convenience. And of course, sometimes when we find queen cells, what we're nervous about is swarming, especially, we have bees on hotel roofs, very fancy hotel roofs in Boston. And swarming's a problem. The reason we have that gig is because when one of the chefs was managing the bees, they swarmed 3 times in the spring. And on the fancy waterfront in Boston, and one of them went into a light post and started making comb. Fortunately, we weren't there for that, and we were called in after the fact. And thus far, we've been able to prevent the swarming. But in a situation like that, when I see queen cells, whenever we see queen cells, we're always like, well, are these swarm cells or are they super seizure cells? There are some rules of thumb, but you never can be quite sure. And so, if preventing a swarm is one of the things that you're trying to accomplish, and if you don't know if those queen cells are super seizure cells or swarm cells, that's a good reason to make a split, because you can kind of forestall that swarming urge and make a split at the same time. It's kind of a win-win situation. Now, there's one problem with this. When you find queen cells in the colony, when you didn't expect them, oftentimes it's after you've shaken the bees off the frame, or after you've tapped the frame on the side of the hive to get the bees off, and we find the queen cells kind of hidden in the corners or hidden in the bottom. How many people have ever found an open queen cell and they'd inspected the hive a week before and they didn't see the queen cell there? I know I've missed them. The problem with that is that there's a period of time from about probably day 10 to 14 to be a little bit to have a little bit of buffer on it after the queen started, when her wings are developing from wing buds and when her legs are developing. And in that specific period of time, the queen's actually very vulnerable and she can be injured. You sometimes see queens it looks kind of like deformed wing virus. You might think that it's a virus, but a lot of times it's physical damage to the queen that happened while the wings were developing. I had one memorable time where I had a virgin queen, and one of her front legs was just like this, and she was walking around like this. And that isn't going to be a good queen because she isn't going to smell right to the bees. She isn't leaving the right trail around the hive. And that's almost definitely due to physical damage of the queen while she's developing. So the problem is that you've got this frame, you've just banged all the bees off of this frame, and you say, oh, look, a queen cell, now I'm going to make a split. But you don't know how old that queen cell is, if it's capped. If it's uncapped, if it's still open, you're in pretty good shape because they're very hardy while they're still open. But once it's capped, how capped is it? When was it capped? Was it capped yesterday? Then it might be okay. But when it's been capped for an unknown period of time, you don't know whether that queen has been damaged or not, or likely to have been damaged, or knocked off her food by you banging the frame around. So just keep this in mind. If you're thinking that if you find a queen cell, you might like to do a split, or might like to requeen another hive that you have, or a nucleus or something like that, then use a bee brush and approach everything very gently as you inspect the hive. Because once you've been banging it around, now you don't know what you're doing. You've got this frame, you've got a queen cell on it, or queen cells on it, and now you got to make a decision. Am I going to allocate the resources that are necessary to start up a nucleus colony, or take the time to try to introduce this into a colony to find out if this queen is going to be viable? And the only reason that you're questioning it is because how you've handled that frame already. So just keep that in mind when you're doing your inspections. If you might want to do a harvest a cell and to start a new colony or to requeen, you should treat everything gently and you brush. And I have to say that I have much better luck with a handful of grass than I do with any of the bee brushes that I've ever tried. Use the bee brushes, the bees curl up and they get mad, and you smell the alarm pheromone. And with a brush or some grass, and even yesterday, I just used some straw, and we had a pretty populous hive of bees that we were working with, and I was wearing a t-shirt, this t-shirt, and nothing, just dressed like this, and nobody got stung. With a bee brush, I'm sure that somebody would have gotten stung, or at least the way I use it. Maybe somebody's got other people have better technique than I do. And just remember that the bees are good at hiding those cells, and that if you're looking for a cell, that you really have to look in the corners and in the bottom, and that little flap of comb that's sticking off, and that's in your way, that there might be a queen cell kind of hidden in the middle there. Does that make sense so far? Okay. So we take this one step further and we force the cells. Now when I say force the cells, I mean set up a situation where the bees want to swarm. Not set up a situation where the bees swarm. Set up a situation where the bees want to swarm. Well, what causes the bees to swarm? Primarily what causes the bees to swarm is overcrowding. Is they've filled up the cavity or the volume that they're in. The queen either the volume is so big that the queen pheromone isn't getting to all the areas of the brood, and therefore the workers start to draw queen cells, or that they're out of room and there's no room for the queen to lay, and no room to put nectar and no room to put more comb. Then they're going to want to swarm. So by definition, when you force cells like this, these cells are produced out of abundance, which is what we want. The nice thing about forcing the cells is that you're timing it yourself. You're deciding when those cells are going to get started. And therefore, you don't have to worry about, when were these cells capped? You know when they were capped, and you can handle everything appropriately without guessing. You can make the queen cells available for when they're going to be convenient for you. You think, gee, I think I'm going to want to make up some nukes in 3 weeks. Well, then it's time to start thinking about crowding your bees and getting them to start some queen cells. And the comb can be trimmed for better results, and I'll show you that in a minute. I have some photographs. I used to give talks, and I would describe this like I'm describing it now by waving my arms around and describing it. And then about 1.5 years ago, I was going to give a talk in Florida on this, and it occurred to me, gee, instead of waving my arms around and explaining what it's supposed to look like, I should do it and take some pictures of it. So we'll see those in a second. One of the nice things about this is that, how many people are new beekeepers and aren't confident that they can find the queen? All the experienced beekeepers close their eyes so you don't know who's admitting to that. That's all of us. The problem is that when you find the queen, what do you stop doing? You stop looking for the other queen, right? Right? You're looking for your keys. You find your keys. You're done looking. Same thing with the queen, but probably in the active season, probably about 10% of the time, there's either 2 active queens in there, or a queen and a virgin can be just as problematic as a mated queen when you're raising queens like this. And unless you've got some experience with virgin queens, they can be very difficult to spot in a hive. I'm not confident that I can always find a virgin queen in a hive, even if I know she's in there. Even if it's just a 3-frame nuke, they can just not be there. They disappear. They have that little bee cloak of invisibility that they put on. So essentially what I'm talking about, but the beauty with this is that you don't have to find the queen. That essentially what you're going to do is, and I'm going to give one example here. Let's say you've got 2 deep boxes, you've got 20 frames of bees. So go ahead and take, a couple of frames of food, a couple of frames of honey on the outside, and then inside that a couple of frames with some brood and some pollen. And in the middle you're going to put I'm talking about a 5-frame nuke box now. You put your frame with the brood that you want to raise queens from, and I'll show you this whole process in a minute. And you put that where those 20 frames of bees were, at that location. You've got more bees than can fit in that box now. Just from the bees that you've put in there that have never been out of the hive and don't know how to orient, and with all the bees that have already oriented to that spot. Now you've got 15 frames of bees, and you can either put the queen in there, if you can find the queen can absolutely be in that box. If you don't find the queen, then maybe you take those other 15 frames and you make a split and you put them somewhere else, and if the queen's in here, then they're going to make a new queen anyways. It's just a walk-away split, just like what we talked about. And if the queen's in here, then it doesn't really matter whether this is queenless or queen right. They're going to actually raise queens no matter what because they're so overcrowded. And having some open brood in that hive, maybe a little, not just a few grafts that are queen cells, but some open brood, they're going to hold all the bees over there. So here is my little photographic journey of doing this. It isn't something that I tend to do as part of my operation. I tend to graft or do walk-away splits or harvest. Mostly when I don't really do many walk-away splits, but I do harvest cells, particularly in the city, to prevent swarming. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So, and there's one little confusing thing on this picture is that where I trimmed the comb is exactly where there's a wire. So don't be confused by the wire on here. So what I've done is I've trimmed the comb on a little piece of that piece there, and I trimmed the comb right where there's a transition from eggs to very young brood. Right in the middle, right there. Because, and when I say young brood, I mean brood that you can't see. That you only know that they're there because you see a little bit of royal jelly in the bottom of the cell. I'm talking about eggs that are just hatching there. That's the frame that you want to find, and that's where you want to trim it. Because especially with this older comb, and you can see this is not fresh new comb here, it can be difficult for the bees to reshape the cells into queen cells. And that's oftentimes because there are so many cocoons buried into the cell walls. And that's why oftentimes with old comb, if there's an emergency queen or something, you'll see, or on plastic comb, you'll see that the queen cell comes out and then down. They've floated the queen out and built out. And the reason we do this along the bottom is so that the queen cells are accessible to us. They'll all be on the bottom. We're not trying to punch them out of the middle of the comb. So I trimmed the comb. I crowded the bees into a 5-frame box, and you can see they can't even all fit in the box. And then a few days later, you've got some queen cells right along the bottom there. Now, if I was really going to do this to produce, I did this really just to take a few photographs. I wasn't trying to raise queens. The problem with this is that these cells are really too close together to reliably be able to separate them and not damage the queens inside. So generally, you might want to go through and smush two cells in between, leave one cell, smush 2 cells, leave one cell, smush 2 cells. Then these cells are really easy to separate from one another, just with a pocket knife without impacting the cells around them. But you can see that I got exactly what I was trying to get, which is queen cells on the bottom of the frame where I cut them. I didn't have to, it was a queen-right colony, I didn't have to cut them, I didn't have to find the queen. These are well-fed queen cells because there's so many damn bees in that box and so many foragers coming back to that box to feed them. And now you've got some queen cells that you can use, and you didn't have to find the queen. You didn't have to do anything but move some frames to a 5-frame box and cut a piece of comb. That simple enough? Anybody that doesn't think that they could handle that? Then you can all be raising queens this year, even if you just have one surviving colony. This I call the methods overview, and I'm not going to go into great detail here. But it's one of those interesting things that kind of, it shows a parallel of history over time and sophistication and efficiency happening over time. The Hopkins method of raising queens was just as simple as taking your frame that has the brood on it that you want the queens to be raised from, and turning it horizontally over the brood, a couple inches over the brood nest. And then the queen cells get built down, because now you've got your cells oriented like a queen cell. And generally you would do that, you would remove the queen and do that in a queenless colony of some kind. And these methods get progressively more sophisticated until we get down to Doolittle, where we graft. And grafting is literally with a tiny little tool, scooping the very young larvae out of the cell and putting her into some kind of artificial cell to raise a queen in. I'll talk about some books later, but there's an old book by Frank Pellet that I don't know what your club library is like, but certainly Michael Bush has this as part of his queen rearing old queen rearing books that you can buy from him and probably even read for free online on his website. But Frank Pellet did a great job of, in a very concise way, going through these methods and laying them out, and it's very understandable, like, how it went from one step to the next, and how these were incremental improvements. Yes?
The Pellet book is a free download on the Cornell website. Okay,
so the Pellet book is a free download. It's called Queen Rearing or something. And it's wonderful. I like it mostly because it's very concise. You can get through it and you can get through these methods in 20 minutes and then start over again, and then you start understanding. One of the most important things with queen rearing, I don't do it on a big enough scale that I really have to have a schedule going, but somebody who's doing this for production, there's a whole system that involves your mating nukes and your cell starters and your cell finishers. In order to do this right, you actually have to kind of be on a schedule. And so if you read a queen breeder or a queen rearer talk about their method, it's very specific. On this day you do this, and 6 days later you do that, and it's all very specific. I encourage you to read as many of those as you can, because what you'll learn very quickly is that there's this thing that they're all getting at. And one of them's doing this, and one of them's doing this, and one of them is getting it to it from that direction. And once you read 3 or 4 of them, you start to understand what it is that core is and what it is that you're trying to do. And once you understand what you're trying to do, you don't have to follow any method. You can improvise based on what you find, and you can raise good queens. And that's the kind of, I'm not a rote guy. I don't want to tell you step 1, step 2, step 3. I want you to understand it so that you're out in your bee yard and you're like, oh, I need to do this, so that means I can just do this and this will happen. So some of what that core is, that thing that has to happen, is the bees have to want queens. Whether they're queen right or queenless, it doesn't matter. That crowded 5-frame nuke, they want queens just as much as that walk-away split that doesn't have a queen in it wants queens. So it isn't important that they're queen right or queenless, it's important that they want queens. There have to be larvae of the proper age. And that means larvae that are probably under 18 hours old is really the best. Some of the literature suggests that you can use larvae up to 3 days old. I know Dave Tarpey has I think it's a fairly new paper out that looks at 18-hour and younger larvae versus 2-day-old larvae. And he seemed to find a big difference in the weight of the queen and the size of the queen. There was some other data that I'm not so sure about that he quantified well enough in that paper. But I think and I haven't given it a close enough read to say if it's a really good study or a mediocre study, but Dave Tarpey's a good guy, and I'm sure some of this stuff is absolutely valid. One thing I question is, I don't know, we're always told that the bigger the queen, the better. And that may well be true, or it may well be true with just some of the metrics that we're looking at, that a bigger queen can store more sperm, and we might say, okay, that's the important thing. But that's a little bit like making a judgment that a professional bodybuilder is what a healthy human looks like. They're not necessarily that healthy. They have very strong bodies, and if you were going to evaluate humans based on body mass index or how many cinder blocks they can lift, then in fact that might be true. But if you look at what a healthy human is, that might not be it. So I'm not always sure that the biggest queens are necessarily the best ones, but certainly we want well-nourished queens, and certainly the younger the larvae, the better. And that doesn't matter if we're doing a walk-away split or we're grafting. There must be enough resources available for the number of queens being raised. Now, a small 5-frame nuke that's healthy and has a lot of bees in it and has resources and there's a flow on can easily raise several queens. But more than a few queens requires that there be extraordinary resources. And that's why you read about and you might experience, and hopefully you'll do, something where you artificially boost the number of nurse bees that are available to raise these queen cells so that you can raise 30 healthy cells at one time. Remember, we're going towards a sufficiency. There's a big difference between maybe 10 frames of bees that are able to raise 30 cells at once, and 10 frames of bees from a walk-away split that ends you up with 1 queen 6 weeks later. There's a difference there in efficiency, and that's kind of why we go beyond the walk-away split. And again, like that photograph that I showed you, the queen cells have to be separable enough that we can use them. If we let them just all hatch out, and anybody ever find the queen cells with the holes in them, and the tip is still on the queen cell, that's because there was a virgin in there that took care of things. And so you have to be able to, at some point, separate those cells so the virgins aren't competing with one another. Unless all you need is 1 queen, in which case it's fine to just let them fight it out. So grafting is really, again, this is the efficient way to do things. This is the way that if you want to raise queens commercially, you're going to use. Now there are some systems that don't require grafting, where you put the queen in a special cage and she lays in these special plugs, and then you put those plugs into cells, and the Nicote system, the Genter system. There's a system from New Zealand called the Easy Queen system that's designed especially for royal jelly that does over 400 at a time. The problem with these graftless systems is they require a lot of time. It means that 3 or 4 days before you want to start raising your queens, you have to go find your queen. And before that, you have to prepare things so that things can be set up properly. And when you find the queen, you have to pick her up, and then you have to put her inside this cage. And you can't just do it with a hair clip queen catcher. You've got to actually handle her to make it work right. And then you've got to take the queen out in 24 hours, and if you don't, she'll start laying more than one egg in each cell. And ask me how I know that one. So, on the one hand, these graftless systems don't require you to have the eyesight or to actually go in and scoop the queen out, but they take a tremendous amount of time. If you want to raise queens and you have the resources to raise queens, and you don't feel like you have the eyesight to do it, find a kid in the neighborhood, someone with those really sharp eyes. Because remember, when you're grafting, you don't even have to be around flying bees. So you could set everything up for a 12-year-old kid to graft for you. And you won't have to do it, and it's much more efficient. I highly recommend it, because once you learn how to graft, it really makes all these other ways of doing things seem a little bit silly, because you can graft so quickly once you've learned how to do it. But it seems like a big step to take. It seems like, oh well, I'm just a second-year beekeeper. I don't know if I can do that. Yes, you can. There are several kinds of grafting tools. The traditional grafting tool is a metal, little tiny spoon, generally called a grafting needle. Some of the catalogs sell them as like a stainless steel German grafting tool. These look like dental picks, basically. The problem with, and then there's plastic variations, especially the JZBZ brand is available, and they actually have a few different kinds of tips on them that you can get them with different tips on them. The problem with those kinds of grafting, and then there's natural or homemade grafting tools, and that can be anything from a toothpick that you flatten with your teeth. I know people that do that, to a paper clip that you've hammered out into a little spoon. Some people in the literature have used a single hair from a horsetail. They tie a special knot that kind of ties it into a clover leaf, and they use that. Or you can use a feather. People, you've used almost anything. Those kinds of techniques, it requires that you can get the larvae on them fine, but you've got to get the larvae off. And you've got to get the larvae off without flipping it. So it requires that you have some way to do that. And that means either priming the cells, which I'll talk about in a minute, or doing something to make that possible. And the truth is, if you're part of an operation that is grafting hundreds of queens a week, or hundreds of queens a day, as some of these big operations are, you will probably be faster with a traditional tool or a plastic tool than you will with the Chinese grafting tool that I'll talk about in a minute. But if you're grafting once every 10 days, 30 queens or 60 queens, or you're just raising a couple of rounds of queens in a season, you're not going to be as fast with those. And I think the best analogy is anybody that's ever done a lot of computer work and worked in a specific program, whether it be a word processor or, I remember this specifically with AutoCAD, when I was doing some CAD work, that the people that were really good at it, they were so fast, and they never used the special digitizing tablet that you say, okay, I want a circle, and then go over to the keyboard and type in how big the radius should be. They had their hands on the keyboard, and they had Control Alt C and then type it in. These keyboard shortcuts are something that we learn, and they're very fast if we learn them, but the only way to learn them is to do them a lot. So for anybody here that isn't doing thousands of queens in a season, what's called the Chinese grafting tool is really what you want, and I think I left mine at Adam's house today. But all of the catalogs have a variation of them, and they all call them the Chinese grafting tool. And it's usually I believe it's a piece of horn. It's not plastic, it's a little flexible tongue. And then there's actually a plunger that moves along it, and that plunger allows you to actually push the larvae off. And that means that you don't have to float the larvae off, and I'll show you in a minute. So one thing about the Chinese grafting tool is they're sometimes called the Chinese grafting tool, but more often they're called the cheap Chinese grafting tool. They cost $1 or $3 or $5 a piece, depending on where you get it and what year you get them. But the problem is that they're not consistent. They're cheap. So if you're going to order them, order 5 of them. Don't order 1, because some of them work better than others. Some of them, there's so many subtle. I can't really tell you how to do this because you have to practice, because there's all these subtle things that you do with your hands to get the larvae on there and to not flick the larvae off. You're asking me how I know that one. Not flip the larvae. There are all these things that you have to to take note of. And some days one of them works better for you than others, and then the next day the other one might work better for you. So get a few of them, don't just get one. Okay, and I think all that text is about what I said. So once you've got the larvae of the proper age on the grafting tool, you've got to put it in something. And we call this a cell cup. And this is some kind of artificial cup that we're going to orient, instead of horizontally like a worker, we're going to orient vertically like a queen. Traditionally, wax has been used, and you can kind of imagine if you have a dowel with a rounded end on it, you can dip it in some wax, and you end up with a little cup on there. And there's also the plastic ones, and the good plastic ones that I like are made by JZBZ. All of the catalogs have them. There's two styles. One style has a little pin on the end that goes into a saw curve. The other kind has a dome on the end that has to go into a hole. I used to get the ones that went into the hole until I started teaching other people how to raise queens, and I was running classes. And then I told everybody that as part of the class they were going to get a frame to put these cups in. And then I realized, oh my God, for each one of these bars that I have to make, I have to drill several holes in the bar. Whereas if I use this other kind the kind with the pin, I just have to run it through the table saw once to get a slot going through the whole thing. And then when I thought about that, I said, oh, or I could just order some bottom bars for 18 cents a piece from my local frame builder and cut the ends off and use that. And then I don't have to do anything. So I like the ones with the pins on them. Now, here I am, we've been talking about treatment-free beekeeping and natural beekeeping, and that's our perspective. And I'm telling you to use plastic cell cups. And in fact, if you ask someone like Kirk Webster, who's also known for his natural methods in being pure, he'll tell you to use plastic cell cups. And almost everybody I know uses plastic cell cups. Not everybody, but almost everybody. And there's a reason for it. And I'll relate the story that Kirk Webster told me about it, as to why he went to plastic. Because I asked him the same question that some of you, I think, are probably thinking about me. Why are you using plastic? So Kirk raises queens commercially. He overwinters nukes, he sells queens, he sells nukes. He's got a whole operation going. He's one of these guys with a schedule like what I was talking about. And when you have a system like that, if one part of the system fails, it throws your whole season off. All of a sudden you don't have cells to put in your mating nukes, and you're behind by weeks. And you've got orders to fill because you planned on having everything work as part of a system. So he was using wax cups that he made from his own wax, and he doesn't use any chemicals in his hive. So his wax is pretty clean, and he actually makes his own foundation from his own clean wax. So you really can't get any cleaner than that to start with. And he had these cups, and everything was going great. And then one time he did a graft, and he went to take the cells out, and none of them had taken. Whole cell bar frames with not a single cell drawn out. And that screwed up his season. But, like all beekeepers, he was curious as to what was going on. And all he could think was maybe there's something with the wax. So he made up some more cups with a different batch of wax. And then he grafted, and he alternated the source of the cups in the cell bar. One from the batch that didn't take, one from the new batch, one from the batch that didn't take, one from the new batch. And he grafted into them, put them in a cell builder, and of course he got just what you'd think he'd get. Every other cell was drawn out. And when he saw this was concerning to him, because he already had problems for this season, but he's thinking about next season and the season after that. And the problem is that obviously there's something wrong with this wax. There's something with this wax that the bees aren't accepting. Whether it's contaminated by a chemical, whether it was overheated, who knows what? But that was the thing, who knows what? There wasn't anything that he could observe or measure that could tell him that one set was different than the other, that one was going to work and one wasn't going to work. So that's when he went to plastic cell cups, because they consistently work. So that's what I recommend, and that's not to say that you shouldn't try buying or making some wax cell cups and using them. But once you're on a schedule, and once you have to have queens at a certain time, once you have plans, you've got to make sure that your queens are going to take, and the plastic cell cups seem to be a better way to guarantee that than the wax ones. You've got to have cell bars, and I talked about you can use a bottom bar with the ends trimmed off. And then you just literally screw deck screws in the holes that are designed for the wires from a frame. You can use an old frame that you've got that you've taken the foundation out of, or a brand new frame. And the deck screw kind of goes into the slot in the bottom of your bottom bar and holds it in place, and you can rotate it for grafting. And even easier is, I think Man Lake for 50 cents each sells bars that fit exactly inside of your frame, that look just like a bottom bar, but they don't have the little shoulders on them. So next time you're ordering something from Man Lake, order a few of those. Then you don't have to fire up your table saw. And I have to say, I love working with wood, but every time I'm going to fire up the table saw, I think about cutting my fingers off. Some things are worth it. A 50 cents cell bar probably isn't. Especially, you're working with a narrow piece of wood, you really have to think about how you're going to do this safely. So 50 cents or 18 cents is a small price to pay not to do that. And if you're a real woodworker and you have your shop set up to just do anything at the drop of a hat, you're not going to listen to me saying this anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Once you've got your cell bars, you've got to have a frame to hold the cell bars. And again, that can be any frame that you've got around for whatever size hive that you're using. And that just the cell bars mount in there. Lighting is important. An LED, now that we have LED flashlights, everything's changed. You get this really bright light at the dollar store. It takes 3 AAA batteries. The batteries last 40 hours. You've got a brighter light than you ever had with those flashlights that take 6 D cells. Remember those? You can't whack anybody over the head with it effectively, but it is bright. And most importantly, it's a very cool light. You're not throwing off a lot of heat. And I like to use a flat, some people like headlamps. There's baseball hats that have little LEDs in them. I like to have the light in my hand so I can move it around and get into the cell easily. And I'm working on some ideas for actually a small LED light that clamps onto the grafting tool itself. And I'll let you all know when I've got one. I've got some prototypes that I've been working on. And the other thing is magnification. And I'm unfortunately at that, I've always had very, 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 very sharp eyesight. And unfortunately, I have to admit to myself that I'm at that age where I don't quite have that sharp eyesight anymore. It's not bad, but even when I had sharp eyesight, a little bit of magnification really goes a long way. Because when we're talking about grafting from a larvae that's 18 hours or less old, we're talking about something that you're probably not going to be able to see. How do you know there's a larvae in there? What do you want to look for? You want to look for a little tiny pool of royal jelly. Because royal jelly is expensive for the bees to produce, and they're not going to put that in the cell unless there's a young larvae in there. So what you're looking to graft is something that you can't see. So magnification is helpful. When I teach classes, what I do is I bring reading glasses from the dollar store. A few different magnifications, for different people. And I've tried everything. I've tried, the big magnifier on the stand. One interesting thing, I bought a fancy big magnifier on the stand that had LEDs all around it to light it, and I was really excited that this was going to be great. And what did I find when I went to use it? How the larvae have their little segmented worms? Well, when I went and turned the light on, what I was seeing was in any cell that had a little royal jelly, I saw the reflection of those individual LEDs, and everything looked like it was larvae all around the outside of every cell. I wouldn't have expected that. Maybe a little diffuser or something on there would fix that problem, but I haven't gone to fix that problem yet. So I find that the reading glasses are really, really the best for me. And for most of the students that I've had, I usually have a bunch of reading glasses and a few other kinds of magnifiers, and everybody ends up with the reading glasses. Now you have to find larvae of the proper age. Now there's a few different ways to do that. I tend to do catch as catch can. I open up the hive that I want to graft from, and I look for larvae of the right age. I look for eggs and the very young larvae that are next to the eggs. And that works okay for me. Somebody like Mike Palmer, whose system I know a little bit and I've seen, he has actually the queens that he's going to graft from, he's got a 10-frame box with a queen excluder in it that isolates 3 frames from the rest of the hive. And so he puts empty combs in there and the queens in that part, and then he can go in, a day later and take the frame that's fully, that's been fully laid up and move it to the other side of the hive, and then 3 days later he knows that he's got eggs hatching. So he's got a whole frame where all the larvae is just about the same age, but more importantly, just about the right age. So again, if you're going to be grafting 200 queens at once, you might want to do that, because it's going to save you a lot of time to know that you've just got it right there. You're not hunting around. Whereas sometimes I have to admit, sometimes I graft a few from one side of the frame and I just feel like I have to spend a little time hunting around and finding good larvae of the right age. All of the books talk about old dark comb makes things easier and works better, so that's what I always did until one time when I knew better. I saw some larvae that were on some freshly drawn comb, and most of our comb is from foundationless, so the bees draw it all themselves. Because there's no foundation, that midrib in the comb that we're used to being thick from the foundation is very thin, so the bottom of the cell, you can almost read the newspaper through. And so I found these larvae of the right age, and I was all set to graft, and I went to graft, and the grafting tool went right through it. So the older dark comb that's a little bit harder and has some cocoons buried in it makes it easier, or if you're on plastic foundation, obviously you're not going to stick the grafting tool through very easily. And you're really relying on that tool to push it straight down, to bend underneath the larvae. So you are relying on some strength of the inside of that cell to do it properly. So, and again, we're going to go over a few of these things a few times. You want to set the mood. You need bees that want a queen. Again, a queenless hive, a crowded hive, whatever it is, bees that want a queen. You want overabundance of nurse bees. You want these queens to be well fed. How do you know if your queens are well fed? Well, with these plastic cell cups, you can actually see how much royal jelly is being stored in there. And you can also see that once the larvae is done eating, if there's a little bit of royal jelly still left in there, then you really know that the queen was well fed, because she didn't finish her dinner. You've got to have fresh pollen. Excuse me. Ramona showed this slide of bee bread, and you can see that bee bread had a little sheen of honey over the surface of it. But sometimes you go into your hive and you see that fresh pollen being stored, and it still has that powdery surface to it. And again, this is something that I have not tested, but everybody says that that's the stuff that you want for the nurse bees to be eating to feed the queen. That pollen that's freshly come in and has been freshly packed. So you want to make sure that you put whatever's going to be wherever you're going to be raising these queens, and not as important with some of these other methods where you're just trying to raise 1 queen or 2 queens. But I'm talking about if you're grafting and you're going to be doing 15, 20, 30 queens at a time. Make sure you put a frame in there, at least one frame that has some fresh pollen on there, that dusty looking pollen. You've got to have incoming food. Again, most people put a little feeder in there, you feed 1-to-1 syrup. I don't, I prefer ideally to just use the foragers from a strong hive by putting that cell builder where that strong hive was. And for me, that's a better option. And if I do feed, what I do is I take some crystallized honey once or twice a day, and thank you. And just with a spoon, just kind of scoop some in the hive, and just let the bees know that there's stuff coming in all the time, so that they feel prosperous and feel like they can afford to raise all these queen cells that I'm giving them. And again, you've got to have graft from the proper age larvae. The larvae, anybody that's seen larvae in the cells, and I'm not talking about queens, I'm talking about workers, they look like little cocktail shrimp, like from the Chinese restaurant. I'm laying on their side. Bees they're not like us, they don't breathe through their mouth. They have holes in the sides of their neck called the thoracic spiracles, where they breathe through. When they're larvae, there's only one segment of the larvae, it's a little worm. They actually go all the way across the body. And when I'm done with the rest of this presentation, I actually have some videos of these larvae that I've taken under a microscope, and you can actually see them eating and see them breathing. But what's important is that larvae is laying on her side. And so one side is facing up and one side is facing down. She's breathing through the spiracles that are on the side facing up, and she's not breathing through the spiracles that are on the side facing down. If you graft the larvae out of that cell and you flip her over when you put her into the cell that she's going into, she will drown, because she's still breathing through that same set of spiracles. So don't flip the larvae. The first time that I tried grafting, it didn't take, and then I went back to my books and I said, oh yeah, don't flip the larvae. I don't think I was careful about that. Then I went and did it again and everything worked fine. The larvae requires food. The larvae can dry, when you're grafting the food, the brood food, the royal jelly, the bee milk, whatever you want to call it, provides food for them. The larvae is just sitting there in a pool of food and just eating. When I show you these videos, you just see they're just and you can see this peristaltic motion going through them. They're just eating constantly. They increase in mass by 1,000 times in 6 days. And then they only poop once at the end of that. This is perfect food. There's moisture, and there's nutrition, and there's almost nothing else in there. And if you can imagine anything growing 1,000 times in 6 days, I mean, we're talking about an extraordinary thing going on. So traditionally, when I was talking about using the traditional kinds of grafting tools, you kind of have to prime the cells. And when I say prime the cells, that means put a little bit of royal jelly into the cell before you graft into it. And that's mostly so that when you put the grafting tool back in there, that the liquid kind of grabs onto the larvae a little bit and you can drag the tool away and leave the larvae there. With the Chinese grafting tool, it isn't so important. And in fact, with the Chinese grafting tool, you can scoop up enough royal jelly to keep the larvae moist, and most of us don't bother with that. There is a technique called double grafting. I don't know anybody that uses it, but all the books mention it, so I kind of figure I ought to let you know what it is, so that you know what it is that you're not going to do. Double grafting is that you do a graft one day, and then the next day you take those cells out and you remove the larvae. Because the first thing that the bees do when you prime the cells and then graft and then put it in the hive is they take that royal jelly out and they put new royal jelly in. Whether we call it royal jelly or brood food or bee milk, we're talking about a substance that is similar in ingredients but has different proportions in it. And when the nurse bees are feeding the young larvae, they actually touch each larvae with their antennae. And they can sense exactly what the nutritional needs of that particular larvae is at this particular time. And the brood food that they produce is kind of custom mixed for her. And once they're making queens, it's probably a little bit different. So when we take this royal jelly and we graft the larvae in there, well, once they decide that they're going to start raising this as a queen, they replace that royal jelly with new royal jelly. And so the idea with double grafting is to get a larvae in there and get them to put some food in there. Then we remove the larvae and then graft again. And it's a lot of extra work, and I don't know anybody that does it. But you should know about it because you will see, if you, after this, you're thinking, oh gee, I think I'm going to start grafting this year, and you start reading some books or Googling about grafting, you'll see mentions of it. That's what double grafting is and what people mean. We don't bother, and I don't know anybody who's raising queens right now that bothers, because everybody's using the plastic cups and the Chinese grafting tools. And with that setup, the grafting tool does a nice job of slipping, I have photographs of it in a minute, does a nice job of going underneath the royal jelly and not taking the larvae out of the food, but taking the food and the larvae all at once. And then, because you have a plunger, you can kind of push the whole thing off into the plastic cup, and it really doesn't require that you prepare it with anything. Some people prime with yogurt, some people prime with water, some people prime with royal jelly. I don't think I've ever primed a cell, because I started with this system and it works fine, so I've never seen a need for it. So I'm going to go with none of the above here, but it's just good to know why, it's important to know why, so that if you try using a different kind of grafting tool, you'll understand why it isn't working if it worked with the Chinese grafting tool. And one thing that I added to this presentation is pre-feed. And this was on BL, which is one of the beekeeping lists that has a bunch of researchers and commercial beekeepers on it. And we were talking about queen rearing and tips and tricks for raising queens. And this is one that Randy Oliver brought up that I'd never heard before. And it really is good, and I tried it, and it works great. And what that is that you've got your cell builder. You've got a colony that's set up to raise queens. You've got an overabundance of nurse bees in there. And you've got your frame of larvae that you're going to graft from your donor colony. What you'd really like is well-fed queens that have a lot of royal jelly around them, right? So what you do is, instead of taking that frame and going and grafting from it, You stick it in your cell builder for about 6 hours. So all those abundant nurse bees, they start feeding these larvae. Then when you take it out, you've got larvae that are floating in big pools of royal jelly, that are well fed, that are fattened up a little bit, and it makes the grafting easier. It makes the larvae more stable because they're less likely to dry out because they're in more food. And it really is a nice technique that I've never read anywhere. I never read anybody else discuss that, but it was a suggestion that I went out and tried immediately and was immediately convinced that this is worth doing. It doesn't mean that you can't raise great queens without doing it, but it's a nice little trick. So, you can see I've got a bunch of slides of larvae and eggs here. Now, that larvae that's right in the middle there, in between all the eggs, that's what I like to see for grafting. And the only way that I know to describe it is it has a thread-like quality to it. It isn't chubby. It looks skinny. It looks thready. That's different than starving. That's not a larvae that's not in any food. This picture's not so good, but you can see it sitting in a little silver pool of brood food, which is silver because of the flash in this case. And you'll notice, if you look closely at the eggs, that there's no royal jelly. There's no food there for them. Because the eggs have yolks in them. The bees don't feed the eggs. They feed the larvae. And that's why what you're looking for is if you see eggs and you see a little tiny pool of brood food in a cell and you don't see anything else, that's what you want to graft from. Because you're going to have trouble seeing that larvae, but you know it's there if there's brood food. Because again, that brood food's expensive for the hive to produce. They're not going to put it in an empty cell. They're not going to put it in a cell with an egg because there's no need for it. So in this photo, you can kind of see that one right there that I'm pointing at has a nice thread-like quality to it. It's skinny, but it's in a big pool of food. But if you look at like that larvae or that larvae, they're fat. They've got some fatness to them. To me, that's too old. So, it's easier to do it if you have something to compare it to rather than just saying like, oh, I'm looking for something that looks like this. When you see a frame like this, you can kind of see the difference. And also the one in the upper left-hand corner is also probably a good one to graft from. So here's a grafting tool, and you can see I hope it's visible enough. You can kind of see that there's this little clear tongue that's kind of gone underneath the royal jelly and underneath the larvae to scoop it out. This is one of those Chinese grafting tools. Then here's a little bit bigger picture of pretty much the same thing, and you can see that plectrum, that tongue, just curves underneath and pulls the whole thing out. Now there's a little bit of nuance. What? Yes, I colored it blue to try to make it a little bit more visible. Again, there's some technique to this. To get the larvae on there and lift it without flicking it takes a little bit of practice. And you should practice on some of these older larvae. Now, the older larvae aren't necessarily easier to graft from because they're heavier, and they act a little bit different on the grafting tool. But at least you can see what you're doing and you can get some kind of feedback as to how to get it underneath. And it really is that you're following the side of the cell with the grafting tool, and when the tip hits the bottom, it just curves underneath. And again, the larvae's curved, you're going to tend to want to come from the curved end because it's easier to get underneath that one point than it is to get at the 2 points on the ends. That's not to say that I've never grafted the other way, but it's just a hint that might make it a little bit easier. And this is an example of one of those things that you don't see until you take photographs and take a close look at the photographs. What you're seeing here, you notice that this is still standing up. It's not laying down like a larvae. But if you look at the lower, this is kind of like a mermaid, Bee eggs don't hatch. They dissolve, and the end of the egg that's attached to the bottom of the comb, to the bottom of the cell, has a small micropore, a small hole in it. And when it's time for the egg to hatch, and I don't have a better word to describe it but hatching, so I'm just going to keep using hatching, even though it dissolves. It starts at that bottom end, and it dissolves moving up. And you can see it looks almost like you're just kind of degloving the thing, but it's really the shell is dissolving. And so you can see that that's definitely a worm on the bottom. It's definitely an eggshell on the top. But underneath the eggshell, you can see a little bit of the segmentation of the worm underneath that's hatching. But still, there's no food. So you can see that they don't start feeding these larvae until they've actually hatched. They don't put food in just before the eggs hatch. And that's a larvae that was literally the next cell over from that one. That's a young larvae. That's about a 1/2 millimeter long. You can see it's in a nice little pool of brood food. And this is a nice one. You can even see the head. I mean, you can see the difference between the head and the tail. When you're grafting and when you're looking at observing bees directly, you don't really see that. You just kind of see this segmented worm. But there's definitely a head in here. If you can graft from that, you're doing great. But that's really, I mean, that's not 18 hours old. That's probably, an hour old. That might just be a few minutes after that. It's laid down, and the bees have started to feed it. But see the difference? No food at all, laying down and swimming in a pool of food. Your larvae will cook in the sun. Your larvae will dry out. Your larvae will chill. They're actually very, very hardy as far as physically manipulating them. It's difficult to harm them with a grafting tool. But once you started to graft from a cell, if it doesn't go right, it's usually better to start with another cell, just because you start to get to the point where you're not sure if you're flipping the larvae or not. It's one of those things, when you do it right, it just goes right. And when it isn't going right, and you keep trying to correct yourself, and you keep trying to fix it, it's just going to go further and further south, and you're much better off starting with a new one. Most people recommend having a warm, damp cloth that you can put over either the brood frame or the cell bars you're grafting to keep the brood from drying out. But again, the best care for the larvae comes from the bees. And my own technique is that I don't bother with the cloth. I just am as fast as I can, and I run it back out to the hive. I make sure that I've got everything prepared before I start. And I've had good luck that way. But if you're not feeling so confident, or you're not feeling fast, or you have to travel a 1/4 mile from where you're grafting to where your cell builder is, then some kind of warm, damp cloth might really do you some good to help keep the larvae warm and keep them moist. So the mechanics. Your virgin emerges from the cell. After she emerges, assuming that she isn't fighting it out with other virgins and all that kind of thing, she has to mature. Anybody ever seen that? I remember when we were first keeping bees, I remember we saw a newly emerged worker, and we thought there was something wrong with her. She looked kind of dusty, she looked kind of soft, she was a little bit wobbly on her feet. And so we emailed Dee Lesby, who we were talking to a lot at the time. We were getting a lot of advice from her. We said, "What's wrong with this bee?" And the answer came back, "Oh, that's just a cute baby bee." It's just a newly emerged bee. Callow is the word that's usually used to describe that. So when the virgins emerge, they're a little bit wobbly and they're definitely soft. They mature, they harden up, their exoskeleton hardens up, their wings kind of harden up a little bit. They become they become colonized by the bacteria that they need. And all that happens in the first few days, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And then she takes her orientation flights, and if you're lucky, you get to see this. I got to see this once, just by accident. I knew I had a new queen, and I was out looking at the entrance of the hive, and all of a sudden there was the queen at the entrance of the hive, and she took off. And about a minute later, she was back. And a few minutes later, she did it again, and she was gone for a longer period of time. And I ran and I said, "Ramona, you got to see this." And they do just what the workers do. They come out of the hive, they memorize what it looks like in front of the hive, and they go back in. They come back out, and they fly further afield. And they get oriented so they can make their way back. So remember, the queens don't always, but they tend to fly a couple of miles to mate. The mechanics are that the queens tend to fly further than the drones as a way to keep the inbreeding from happening too much. It's an orientation flight, and we'll get into this before, instead of a mating flight, because when they come back from a mating flight, the penis from the last drone that they mated with is still in them, and you can see it. Generally called the mating sign. The queen can mate several times while she's on that flight, and the way that works is that the drone that's about to mate with her pulls out the appendage from the last drone that left it in there. So when she comes back to the hive, what you're seeing is only from the last drone that she mated with. And we'll talk about some of this other stuff differently. So I've just got 2 slides here that, Nancy Moran sent me and allowed me to use in the presentation, but she didn't want these to go online. So I just asked, you can certainly record audio if you're recording, but if you've got a camera on the screen, move the camera off the screen for these next 2 slides just so that I can, there's nothing shocking or terribly confidential. It's just that this data hasn't been published yet. It's a couple of years away from publication. And you don't want to jeopardize it or pervert that process at all, because we really need this to happen in an orderly fashion. And this has to do with workers, not with queens. Again, they haven't gotten to the queens yet with this. But what you see here, each of these colors represents one of the core bacteria species that lives in the gut of the bee. And this axis down here, that axis is how populous they are in the bee gut. This axis is time in days. And you can see that by day 3, they've got all the colors. Now they still have some growing to do to get to full population. But by day 3, they've got all of the species of bacteria that they need are already colonized into their gut. That's really the important thing with that slide. And I bring this up because I do a lot of raising queens, and I have the virgins emerge in an incubator, in either a glass tube or some kind of cage. And I've been doing that for a few years. And after we talked to Nancy and she mentioned this data to me, I said to myself, gee, that might be why we get, virgins are notoriously fragile. They die in captivity in incubators very quickly, very easily. And it seems to me that when I give a presentation, I like to come up with something that I can say that I think I'm doing wrong, that I have to change because I've learned something. And this is what I've learned that it's going to make me change. And I'm going to do a lot less work with the incubator, or if I do, I'm going to make sure that that those queens go into a hive where they can be properly inoculated very quickly. So I'm not going to read this out loud because, again, this is a quote from this work that they're coming on. But basically what she's saying here is that when the queen first emerges, I can't say queen, when the worker first emerges, because that's what they're looking at. And this is what Ramona talked about. That, again, all kinds of various bacteria start to colonize the gut. But once that process starts, it seems to make the environment right for the proper stuff to colonize it. And so first you get kind of random stuff happening, and then you get these core species to colonize. And within 4 to 6 days, they've got everything they need. And that's what's making me think that having them in an incubator for a couple of days is a terrible idea. Because some species, once they really become established, they're not going to be displaced just because another species says, but I'm supposed to be here. You're not supposed to be here. It's tough. And the queens get it. Okay, that's all of the unpublished stuff, so everything else is fine. Now, we talk about cell builders. There's 2 kinds of cell builders. There's a starter and there's a finisher. You don't need to use 2 different kinds of cell builders. You can use one colony to raise your queen. Certainly that's what a walk-away split is one colony that becomes your cell starter and your cell finisher and your mating nuke, or your mating colony. But it's been pretty well demonstrated that the bees start cells much more enthusiastically when they're queenless. And they finish cells much more enthusiastically when they're queen ripe. And that's why we use a separate starter and a separate finisher, so that we can get them started the best and finish the best, because we don't have one combination that does both. So your starter has to be ripe with nurse bees. Now, oftentimes I do this in a 5-frame nuke or a 2-story 5-frame nuke, and I just shake a lot of nurse bees in there. If you're going to do that, make sure you don't have the queen. Make sure you don't have the other queen. Make sure you don't have a virgin queen. And if you're not really confident that you can effectively feel confident about that, then you can rig something up with a queen excluder to shake the bees through, and then the queens won't make it through, and you'll be pretty much guaranteed that you didn't get a queen in there. The starter has to have the fresh pollen, that dusty-looking pollen that I was talking about, and income. They have to have incoming nectar or some kind of feed. These are the really important things. And if you're going to use a starter for a while, for more than 2 or 3 rounds of starting, you know, the bees, they kind of tend to wear out, and this, we were just in Florida, so I was talking to Florida beekeepers, and they have a different kind of, this is in West Palm Beach, they got pollen coming in right now, and it's not white pollen like we have up here. Our winter bees can live up to 6 months in this part of the country. Our summer bees, in the height of the season, they might only live 2 weeks before their wings wear out and they die. What allows those winter bees to live so long? Because it just doesn't seem like they should. And one of I think the prevailing theory, the thing that I believe is the case, is that those winter bees can live so long because they were the last big round of brood that the colony produced. And that last round of brood doesn't have to do something that every round of brood before them had to do, which is to nurse another set of bees. It's not unlike mammals. It depletes the body to nurse a generation. And so those workers that emerged that didn't have to do that intensive feeding to build up the hive and make a whole lot more, to nourish a whole lot more larvae, have a lot more fat reserves in their bodies and can do this. There's a really long document called Fat Bee, Skinny Bee that was done by the Australian Provincial Agricultural whatever that you can find online for free. It's like 150-page document that talks a lot about this stuff. And that is an excellent document. Even though we don't live in Australia, it's very relevant and something that is generally recognized as a standard text in the industry that people refer to as an authoritative source. So after you've done a couple of rounds of starters in there, you started to deplete the resources in that colony to raise the next round of brood. So it's really good if you want to keep raising, maybe you only need a few queens, maybe you only need 2 rounds of bees. So at that point you could just leave a cell in there and let it become a nuke, or you could use it to boost up a hive that's weak, that's otherwise weak. You've got all these young bees in there that are going to make great foragers and bring in a lot of food. But if you want to keep it starting cells, then you've got to refresh it. It means you either got to shake some more nurse bees in there, or if you put some frames of capped brood that's emerging in there, then you've got those young bees emerging into the colony. And you've always got to keep an eye on these things, that they don't put a queen cell somewhere that you didn't expect, that there was an egg somewhere that you missed. But refreshing the starter is important if you're going to keep using it. Traditionally, the cell finisher, you finish the cells above an excluder where the queen's below the excluder. So the colony is queen right, but the queen doesn't have access to the cells, because sometimes the queen can want to chew down those cells. You've already put some effort into producing them. You don't really want her to do that. A finisher can finish many more cells than a starter can start. So traditionally, you might have you might be starting cells every 2 days, and all those cells are going into you might have 5 or 6 frames from that starter and the finisher at once. When you're running a finisher, it's not unlike you're building cells. You want those young bees in there, and you want the queen to be able to lay below that excluder. You don't want to short circuit it. You don't want her to get plugged up. You don't want them to try to swarm. So what you do, and we'll talk about this in a second for another reason. There's this very simple manipulation that you do using an excluder in this way, where what you do is once a week or once every 10 days you go into the hive and you take all the eggs in open brood and put it above the excluder, and all of the capped brood below the excluder. And what happens when you do that is that as those capped brood emerge, while they're young nurse bees, they go up through the excluder to the top to take care of all the larvae and all the open brood that's up there. Those empty cells now are available for the queen to lay in. So you've got this concentration of nurse bees up in the top. And again, we're going to talk about that in a second here. A starter finisher, if you just need a few queens, you can just shake a bunch of nurse bees into a 5-frame nuke, and you can start the cells in there, and you can finish them in there, and you're fine. When you're done, and then when you're done, you can just leave one cell in there, and you've got a nuke. that works fine. So now, I want to talk about how many people have heard of a cloak board? Okay. The cloak board is an interesting thing. My favorite thing about the cloak board is, let me explain what a cloak board is. A cloak board is something that you put in between two boxes. It's like a little shim that you put between two boxes. It either has an excluder, a queen excluder built into it, or you use it with a queen excluder. So if you have a cloak board that doesn't have a queen excluder on it, remember that you've always got to use a queen excluder with it. And all it is, it's got a little slot and it allows you to slide a sheet of metal or a sheet of masonite in between the two boxes to separate the two boxes completely. That website there, the honeybeesweet.com/?P=829, that's a website, that's a set of instructions for using a cloak board. I don't really use a cloak board, so I'd rather you get the instructions from somebody that does. But I do understand it. Now, you'd think that a cloak board is called a cloak board because it cloaks the queen from the upper box. It's a cloaking mechanism. But the best part about the cloak board is that it was invented by a guy named Harry Cloak. That's why it has an E at the end. With the cloak board, you do just that manipulation I was just talking about, that every 10 days you go in and you move all the cap brood below the excluder and all the open brood and eggs above the excluder. So you focus all of the nurse bees up in the top. And the cloak board allows you to have this one hive that you don't have to disassemble that can be your starter and your finisher. There are some details with the entrances and stuff that I'm not going to go into here because I think it would be a little bit confusing. And again, if you Google cloak board or you go to that website, you'll see all different ways to do this. And again, read a bunch of different ways to do it, and then you'll understand what has to happen, and you can do it however you want. But what you do, essentially, is you've got these nurse bees all focused on the top, and you've got the queen right bottom, and you slide this thing in. Well, all of a sudden, that top box is now a queenless colony that's stuffed full of nurse bees. That's your queenless starter. So you put your cells in there, or you could do it with a trimmed piece of comb like I did with the crowding. Again, I'm talking about grafting for efficiency, but there are all different ways to do this. You could just take a frame of brood that you put in there in the top, and if there's young brood in there, they'll start raising queens whether you're grafting or not. So now you've got your cells started at, and after 2 days, what do? You come back along and you slide that cloak board out. So now those two halves of the colony are now reunited back into one colony. It's now a queen right finisher, and you didn't have to do anything. You didn't have to set up 2 different hives. You didn't have to do anything. Now, it means that you've got to wait until the finisher's done before you can start another round in there. But it's a great way to do things, and it's something that people who only need to raise a few queens do, and it's something that commercial queen raisers do as well. But it's not required, and this is a little pet peeve that I have. I often hear people talk about this as the cloak board method. Or I hear people say, "Oh, I'm gonna start raising queens this year. I just have to order a cloak board so I can do it." And again, this comes from understanding what is happening here. What does that cloak board actually do that a excluder doesn't if you combine it with a piece of plywood that fits over the hive? All it does is keeps you from having to separate the 2 boxes, put a board in between and put the box down, and then 2 days later, take that box off, remove the board, and put the box back on. If it's your first time raising queens, you're just going to raise a few cells. That isn't a huge, what is that, 3 minutes of work? Maybe a little bit more. Maybe you feel like you have to put a veil on when you do that versus not having to put a veil on to slide the thing in and out. But you're going to have to open it up to put your grafts in anyways. You're going to have to separate the boxes to rotate the frames every week or every 10 days anyways. So it really doesn't get you that much on a small scale. Again, if you've got 20 of these going at once, it might save you a little bit of time and it might keep you from putting a lot of bees in the air. But by no means do you need it. By no means does this method require that you have a cloak board. By no means should you wait to get a cloak board to start raising queens. Anything will work, even if you don't have a table, if you don't have any woodworking equipment and all you've got is an extra top cover, you can use that as a cloak board. It won't slide in, you've got to separate the boxes, but you can just separate the boxes, put an extra cover on there, even if it's got a metal top, who cares? And you just pop it back on, and take it off. So all the corkboard saves you is lifting that top box twice. And maybe it keeps you from getting stung once or twice, but we're beekeepers. Getting stung is kind of part of the attraction. But this virgin queen is only half of the equation, or even less than half of the equation, because the queen has to mate with somebody, has to mate with drones. So, raising queens this time of year in Pennsylvania doesn't do you any good. There's no drones flying. You can do all the grafting that you want, but as far as I know, no one's been able to get bees to mate in any kind of indoor cage or screened-in cage. And in Brazil, I've seen pictures of a giant tower that they built to try to do this, and they still didn't get it to work. So unless you're going to do instrumental insemination, it doesn't do you any good. Well, okay, so there are drones available. Are they desirable? Well, maybe they're drones from the migratory operation that's just set up next door. Maybe they're drones from feral bees, which is probably exactly what you want. Maybe they're drones from your neighbor who has really vicious bees, and maybe you don't want those. So you have to think about what the drones are and where they're coming from. And there are some means to control the drone population. You can do instrumental insemination, which I see some value for in some kinds of breeding programs and in some research, but I don't really have any interest in instrumental insemination myself. So the two real methods that you have are drone saturation, which means just making sure that you make sure that bees that you want to be the drone fathers of your virgin queens have a lot of room to draw drones, either foundationless frames or drone combs. And saturate the area with the desirable drones. Or isolation. In isolation, we are lucky we have bees on a small island in Boston Harbor where there's a small organic farm, and we're the only ones with bees on the island. So we can actually, and it's far enough offshore that 95% of the drones on there are going to be from our colony. So we can really control things quite well there. Kirk Webster does it in the mountains. He has an area in the mountains that there just isn't enough forage to support bees, so there's no feral bees and there's no beekeepers that are keeping bees up there because they just have to feed all the time and not get honey. So he does it at the height of the season when there is some forage available and the bees can survive, but nobody overwinters up there. So he moves his mating nukes up there and he moves his drone colonies up there for the season just to do the mating, just because he can isolate things a little bit there. There's a lot of other perspectives on raising queens and breeding than what you're going to hear from me. We're not nearly done yet. Michael Bush's website has some great older books, and he's actually published some of these in printed form that I recommend. KirkWebster.com is Kirk Webster's website, and that's where you can read about his method in detail, which is that kind of calendar, and kind of give you an idea of how he's doing it on a schedule. Kirsten Eberston is a researcher, a bee scientist from Sweden, and her thesis was on breeding bees for sustainability. She's very interesting, and some of her talks are on our website. Paige and Laidlaw wrote some of the technical books on queen rearing, and if you're going to really get into this, that book is worth reading. Queen Rearing Essentials or something, I can't remember the name of it, but Paige and Laidlaw, you'll find it. The Frank Pellet book I talked about, and as we heard, that's available for free on the Cornell site. Mike Palmer's been working on a book. He's been working on it for a while, so we keep bugging him, and I'm hoping that he sees some of these videos and sees that I'm bugging him, that he's got to get that book out. One thing that is worth noting is that the great beekeeping books from the past, and there have been a lot, the tradition of beekeeping books comes from commercial beekeepers. A.I. Root, Langstroth, C.C. Miller, Doolittle, all these people, they weren't researchers, they were beekeepers, and they made their living keeping bees. And it's something that we're missing now, that all the bee books are coming from people like us. We were essentially hobbyists when we got the contract to write our book. I won't make any excuse for that, but that's just the case. And the bee books are coming from kind of more academic area, and we know what academic farming is like. Academic beekeeping isn't much different. one of the farmers that we work with talked about that he had this college professor come up and say that he had this new method for growing corn and really, doubling the density of corn growing and stuff, and he'd done some research and he'd actually proven it works. Well, when he looked at it, what it was graduate students going around and hand pollinating everything. That works great if you've got some graduate students that are paying to do hand pollinating for you, but not so good if you're paying workers to do it for you. So I'm very much looking forward to Mike Palmer's book because he is a commercial beekeeper and not an academic, and he's a very good commercial beekeeper, and he does great work. We've been up visiting him and seen his operation. So now we're going to get into genetics for a minute. Do we want to, I don't know, how are we doing on time? Do we want to take a little break before we get into this, or do we want to keep going?
Break? Raise hands. People want to break?
Okay, so I keep going?
Do people want to break?
Okay. Do you want to take 5? Okay, because this is going to get intense in a minute here. So. Okay, so I'm gonna say take 5. Let's try to keep it really to 5 or 7 minutes so we can get back here and get back.
Oh, I don't know. It's blinking, but I don't know what that means.